I ask that you would join with me in assuming a position of prayer, whatever that is for you. O Creator who loves all creatures big and small, we gather today only steps from what the indigenous people of this land called the Quinabiquin, and which most of us have called the Charles. As a child, I remember the Charles was too toxic to swim in because we had turned a beautiful river into a dumping ground. God, we have gathered today because just as we have desecrated the Charles, we have desecrated so much of our planet. We have used her as a dumping ground to satiate our ever-growing appetite for consumption. And scientists have warned us of the consequences, but too often our actions have not responded appropriately to the crisis. We are here today because we are in a crisis, and if we are really honest, we are in need of a miracle. Forgive us for our recklessness and help us turn in a different direction. Just as citizens and scientists and government officials work together to clean the Charles, let us work together to change our relationship with this, our earthly home. Teach us to use less, so there is enough for everyone. Let us give rise to a world where we power ourselves with your gifts of sun and wind. And as we create a new world, let us band together to protect those who are already suffering with the consequences of our warming planet. Help us to restore the island of Puerto Rico and give justice to its people. Let us bring relief to the folks in Ellicott, Maryland, recovering from yet another overwhelming flood. Let us be in solidarity with our prayers and our finances with folks around the world starving as a result of drought. Let us heed the words of Pope Francis to address the peril of the planet and the plight of the poor. I pray for each decision maker in this room. On this day, I pray for an extra outpouring of courage as they step up to this daunting task. Fill them with creativity as they search for ways to address this crisis. Imbue them with a sustained commitment to keep moving forward, even as there will be temptation to focus on the politically expedient above the existentially significant. Let this be a day where our actions match that which you called us to love you and to love all our neighbors with the fullness of our being. We ask this today in whatever name by which we call you. Amen.
Now please welcome to the stage President Robert Brown, President of Boston University.
It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to Boston University for the Boston Climate Summit. We are delighted to host this meeting organized by Mayor Marty Walsh as part of his leadership of the urban and global challenge of climate change. Cities and their mayors are at the front lines of the climate change challenge, both in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and for preparing to mitigate the impact of the inevitable temperature increases. Today, over half of the world's population lives in cities, a number that is expected to rise in the decades ahead. Clearly, sustainable urban development will be key to mitigating climate change. The actions of cities, collaborating with their for-profit and not-for-profit institutions, can make a real difference. By changing transportation usage, modernizing building codes, adopting renewable energy sources, cities can both prepare for the impact of global warming and mitigate its impact. City leadership is key, and I'm so delighted to see so many mayors with us this morning. Because I believe we are in a period of what Bruce Katz of the Brookings Institute calls the new localism, to describe the need for actions by cities built around their own planning, their own internally financing mechanisms. You clearly realize this is a huge challenge, and evident by your attendance at this meeting. Boston University has an important stake in this challenge. As you can tell as you came to our campus, for those of you with us last night and this morning, we have deeply urban roots. We are at the center of the city. And we have our role as being an urban neighbor institution, but also as a major research university. Both traits are clear in the initiatives of our campus. First, in our initiative on cities, we emphasize the importance of city governance and planning. Second, and probably most importantly, is our climate action plan, where we have institutionally set a high bar for playing our role in mitigating global warming and for preparing our campus for climate change. Our plan calls for reaching zero net emissions by 2040 and an investment of over $140 million in this decade in infrastructure to lower energy consumption and to begin to mitigate our campus against the impacts of temperature rise and sea level rise. Finally, our role in sponsoring research into how to meet these challenges. I'm very proud that our Institute for Sustainable Energy, directed by Professor Peter Fox-Pinner, who's with us this morning, is playing a leading role in planning being carried out by the Green Ribbon Commission, a very important group in terms of focusing the strategy for the city on climate change. I think Boston University has skin in the game, as do all of you. I look forward to hearing the discussions from today. But it is really my pleasure this morning to introduce our Mayor, Marty Walsh, of the great city of Boston, whose leadership brought us together and is driving so much change and innovation in the city of Boston. Mayor Walsh.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Boston. And I want to, first of all, thank Reverend Mariama White-Hammond for our opening prayer here this morning. Thank you for being with us this morning. And I'm really excited to see leaders from all across the country and across the globe coming together in our city because it's important for us that we take a stand for our planet and for all the people. And it's great that you're here, so thank you. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge just a few folks that are in the room today. I could probably acknowledge almost everybody in the room today if I had to, because everyone in this room has had such a tremendous impact on the environment and climate change. But I want to thank President Bob Brown and Boston University for hosting us. His team has been absolutely incredible, and you've been amazing, so thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank Chief Austin Blackman and his team at the City of Boston, the Environment Department. Austin is the chief of the environment in the city, and in the city, all of the folks that are here today that are assisting work at City Hall, a lot of them work at City Hall and BU, and they're really excited about today's conversation, today's conference, so thank you, Austin, for your great work. I don't see her in the room yet, but Gina McCarthy, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency under President Obama. Thank you, Gina, for your leadership, and I know she's going to be with us later on today. She's done some incredible things in our country and continues to do them here in the private sector in Boston and the United States. So thank you, Gina, for what you do. I want to welcome all the mayors that are here and all the cities represented. Mayors from Massachusetts, mayors from LA, on the West Coast, mayors from the central part of the country, and mayors from other countries, as well as all the cities represented. Thank you for being with us this morning. And there's two other people I want to just make a note to. As one of my duties as mayor of Boston is to co-chair the Green Ribbon Commission, which is a group of business leaders, nonprofit leaders who really are working on reducing carbon emissions and really at the forefront of the conversation around the climate. And the co-chair actually was one of the founders, or the founder of it. It was here with us, Amos Hostel. I thank Amos for being with us this morning. And the executive director of the Green Ribbon Commission, who was at the event last night, those of you that were there, I gave him a shout out, is John Cleveland. Thank you, John, for being with us this morning. And finally, I'd like to just thank Secretary Kerry, a true champion for climate action, somebody who's made sure that climate change is seen as a global security issue. He's the architect of this summit, our partner since day one, and how this came to fruition today was that when the United States, President Obama and Secretary Kerry got together with the government of China to have the Chinese Carbon Reduction Summit, and the very first conference was held in Los Angeles with Mayor Garcetti. The second conference was in Beijing, and I had a chance to go to Beijing. And the third conference we announced from the stage was going to be held in Boston. And then we know what happened. A year ago, President Trump pulled out of the U.S. Paris Agreement, which was a very bad decision. He didn't consult with anybody. He made the decision basically unilateral himself, and he certainly didn't consult with America's mayors on that important decision. As mayors, we understand how the climate change is affecting our communities. To us, this is not a political football. This is about immediate health and well-being of our constituents and of our neighbors. So that's how we ended up here today. What gives us hope for the future is a firm belief that we can do something about this, because all of us in this room understand the urgency, we understand the importance of preparedness, and we also have already seen the efforts that we've put in place paying off. And when I say we, I'm talking collectively. As a perfect example is something that happened here in Boston just a few months ago. The winter that we had unprecedented storms, brought effects of climate change through the streets, right up to our doorsteps. In a lot of ways, we were ready for that. That's because of 3 years ago, we convened a regional top climate scientists initiative called Climate Ready Boston, with many of the people here. So when the storm hit, we knew what to do. We were able to prepare people in their infrastructure, and no one was hurt, and we had no permanent damage. However, that could change very quickly. Clearly, science works. There is no question about that. Science also tells us these storms are going to become more common and more intense in years to come. So we're not just talking about surviving another winter. We're talking about real solutions that will keep our community strong and safe for years and generations to come. In one neighborhood, we're building a deployable seawall. Those of you that landed in Boston, if you flew, almost everyone flew, you landed in Logan Airport. That's East Boston. As you saw when you were flying in, it's surrounded by the ocean. We're putting deployable seawalls. We have it in this year's budget, working to move forward. In another area, we're raising Main Street to block the flood pathways, Charlestown. Those of you that are staying here for the U.S. Conference of Mayors, on Sunday is the Bunker Hill Parade. If you walk that parade with me, part of it, you'll be walking on a street that we're elevating. In the North End, we're looking at redoing our parks, 2 parks over there, Langone and Poplar Park. And what we're going to be doing, it's on the side of the ocean as well, on the side of the Boston Harbor. We're going to be raising the park 40 inches. So as we reconstruct the park, a city property, city investment, we're also going to be preparing for the future. Throughout the city, we're building very beautiful buildings, and we're working to make sure that we continue to look at the waterfronts that will protect them behind them. So we're looking at how do we create more opportunities and more barriers around the harbor so we can prepare the buildings and the assets that we have in the city of Boston. We're developing resilient standards for infrastructure and roads through our Public Works Department. We're working with private developers to make sure new buildings are extremely sustainable. We're showing how new development can actually increase resiliency on our waterfront. We're bringing residents and businesses and schools into these conversations because that's something that affects every single person. That's the thing about cities. We're the engines of ideas. We can make the biggest impact at the very beginning. We believe in working together, and we believe in moving forward. And again, the Conference of Mayors, we don't have a label next to our name, Democrat or Republican, because it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, it affects all of us the same, and we need to continue to come up with new ideas. Over the past year, we've been working more importantly than ever. The decision of the President to try and wipe out our progress he has made, he's tried to send us backwards. He's tried to pit the environment against the economy. We know that this is nonsense, and we know that this is irresponsible, and we're not going to stand for it. We're going to continue to move forward. Over the past year, cities have worked together to fill the void in this leadership. In Boston, we committed to being carbon neutral by 2050. We've become a co-chair of the national coalition called Climate Mayors and started doing work and the federal government is refusing to do. Cities all over the country are moving forward as well, one after another, after another, after another. Today, we are more than 400 mayors strong, representing more than 70 million Americans. The leaders of this group are here with us today. The chair of the Climate Mayors is LA Mayor Eric Garcetti, and I'd like to publicly thank Eric for all of the work that he has done, because he was the first person to rise up after we pulled out of Paris and say, we can't stand for this. So Eric, thank you for your great leadership. Our co-chairs, Mayor of Houston, Sylvester Turner. Mayor Turner, right after he got elected, his city was decimated by hurricanes. And I want to thank the Mayor Turner for being with us this morning. And thank you for everything. And Knoxville Mayor Madeline Ruggiero. Thank you, Mayor Ruggiero, for being with us this morning as well, and for the great work that you're doing and being a leader on the climate and in the conference as well. So thank you very much. Cities are ready to take the lead, and cities are certainly leading. And when we combine forces, we can't be stopped. That's why Boston's looking to lead a coalition of cities once again, this time on renewable energies. Today, I'm proud to announce the historic initiative that could create green jobs, cut emissions, and help us meet the goals of the Paris Agreement after all. We can prove to the President that renewable energy can power America. And here's what we already know. In as few as 10 United States cities have come together, we have created the largest solar project in United States history. The largest project, the lower the cost. Today, Boston is asking the U.S. cities for two things. Number one, how much electricity will you use? Number two, how much of that do you want to be green energy by the year 2040? That's it. We're not asking for a commitment to do the project. Over the summer, we'll be collecting data and get free estimates from vendors. Then we'll understand the costs and benefits of renewable energy projects and their size. And if it makes sense, we'll move forward, and we will. If successful, this would save cities, including Boston, millions of dollars. It would create more middle-class, clean energy jobs than any other project in the history of the United States. Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Orlando have already signed on, and I hope this list will continue to grow. This is an opportunity to make a major impact. My hope is that we'll look back at this historic turning point. We already know how the effects are when we work together. We're going to see a lot of great examples of that throughout this day today. We're going to hear from cities that are approaching these challenges in bold and daring ways. And we're going to continue to move forward on this work no matter what it takes, for the health of our communities, for the strength of our economy, and for the love of our cities. Now we're going to jump right into the first panel, and I'm excited to have a conversation about building climate resiliency in cities. I'm going to ask Mayor Rees of Strasbourg, France, to please come up, who's one of our guests today. Bill DeCroce, who's been a strong advocate and a good friend to the city of Boston, and Bud Rees from the Green Ribbon Commission, formerly of the New England Aquarium. I keep talking from there, Bud. Come on up. And now on hand, our moderator, Vivien Lee, who is a longtime champion of the Boston Waterfront. We lost her to Pittsburgh for a while, but we brought her back, so I'm glad to have you back here, and thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Vivien Lee, moderating this opening session on climate resilience. Our distinguished panelists are the Honorable Roland Rees, first elected mayor of Strasbourg, France in 2008 and re-elected in 2014. Mayor Rees is committed to strengthening the European role of his city and to developing an ambitious urban and civic cross-border project. He initiated the return of the tramway to Strasbourg, developing expertise that is now internationally recognized as innovative urban transport and mobility. Mayor Rees is held in high esteem by his colleagues, serving as president of Cité Unie France, a federation of French, local, and regional governments involved in international cooperation, as well as internationally serving as co-president of United Cities and Local Governments. The Honorable Martin J. Walsh was re-elected in a landslide margin to a second term as mayor of the city of Boston. Mayor Walsh has focused on building a more sustainable, equitable city and creating more pathways into the middle class. He has launched, as he's indicated already, Imagine Boston 2030, the Climate Ready Boston, and also Carbon Free Boston. Mayor Walsh is a national leader on environmental issues and serves as the North American Vice Chair of C40 and co-chair of the Climate Mayors. Bill DeGrosse is a 30-year veteran of energy and environmental industries, a board member of the Advanced Energy Economy, and currently serves as president and CEO of Veolia North America, where he leads its water, energy, waste, and resource recovery activities. Veolia is a global leader in environmental solutions and optimized resource management. And in North America, it provides solutions to more than 530 cities and 30,000 businesses. Locally, Veolia's Green Steam Cogeneration Network serves approximately 250 businesses, healthcare facilities, and institutions, reducing the carbon footprint in the Boston-Cambridge area. Bud Riss is Senior Advisor to the Green Ribbon Commission. Bud served for 9 years as the CEO and President of the New England Aquarium, where under his leadership, the aquarium launched a nationwide education program on climate change that now includes more than 100 museums and aquariums. Prior to that, he was a senior fellow at the World Economy Forum at Davos, and for nearly a decade before that, he was CEO of the Union of Concerned Scientists, which has long been in the forefront of research and advocacy on climate change. So let's begin. Each of you are currently leading some innovative efforts on climate resilience. Can you share with us what you're doing in your respective cities? And I'm going to have Maryse begin.
Merci beaucoup. Malheureusement, je vais parler français.
I will speak French. So if you want to use your headsets, I would like first to tell you how happy I am to be here in Boston, which is a twin city. It has been almost 60 years since Boston and Strasbourg have been twin cities. We will celebrate this in 2020. There was a time where Charles Munch, who was the director of the Philharmonic Orchestra of Strasbourg and who was recruited in Boston. So we have a common history which started by music. And we need music. But I will not talk to you about music. I will talk to you about what we are doing in Strasbourg and we have been doing for about 30 years regarding climate change. We were pioneers, especially with regard to transportation. And as early as that time, 30 years ago, I remember that I was wondering, how can we be so blind for so long on vital questions like climate change and the growth of pollution, which is associated with our development model. Today, there's urgency, and I'm very happy that you have taken the initiative to get other mayors from the US and from other countries. And I think that there is urgency. We cannot go on using the political, economic, social models of yesterday. We have to change. And here I have, it's unfortunately in French, but what we call the Statement of Human Rights, which is a continuation of a declaration of 1948. But now we go beyond the political rights. We go beyond that. We want to be sure that we will not create problems for the future generations. We have to change with respect to energy transition, transportation, city planning, and other fields. Otherwise, we will run right into a wall. So we have to do what it takes to stop adding problems. We have created problems in the last 2 centuries, but we have to stop doing that. This is our responsibility to our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. We cannot go on like this. We have first to become aware of the problem. And the city of Strasbourg was one of the first signatory of this statement of the rights of humanity. And I'll be very happy to show it to you and to send it to you. This is on a theoretical level, but we also have to talk about concrete terms. It's not enough to talk about things, to be a philosopher or politicians. We have to act. And there's lots of things we can do. The first things we can do is to change the urban development model. And I think that in Los Angeles, our colleague from Los Angeles is here, and this was one of the most polluted, spreading city, which is spread out on tens of miles, dozens of miles in each directions. And they changed what their model. And we can learn from that. And in Strasbourg, we are now, we want to change the urban patterns. We don't want to take over the countryside around the city. We want to leave room for trees and grass outside. We have to be fed. We need food from the country. So we have to preserve rural areas, and we have to use as best we can the dwellings, the buildings we have. We have to, for instance, use areas that were not used for anything, or old industrial wasteland, and we have to use that efficiently. We should not waste any square inch of the territory of the city. And it is connected with transportation, public transportations. We want to spend less time in transportation. We want everybody to be able to go to work from their residence in just a few minutes. We don't want to have a city like Los Angeles was until recently that spreads out on dozens of miles and forces people to spend many, many hours with their private car and pollutes even more. And I will stop here. I don't want to speak for too long, but we started in Strasbourg in the 90s with public transportation, because this is the requirement for a positive development of our cities. And we created pedestrian areas in the heart of Strasbourg. We created a tramway system. It was not enough. We had to not easy. We have to convince our citizens, and it took some time. But today, we have central areas in Strasbourg which are do not have any private cars. We still maintain space for shared used cars. We developed bikes. We try to create urban agriculture. Instead of having to order vegetables from the other side of the world, we try to grow vegetables within our city. That would help. And all of these are starting to pay off. But we have to keep going in this way. So thank you, Mayor Walsh, for this initiative. I'm very happy that you did that. And I'm happy to answer any other question you may have later on.
I'll just really briefly just touch upon, I talked a little bit about already. We just got back results of a study from UMass Boston about the potential of building a harbor barrier. And what that study really talked about at the end, what we really need is onshore solutions. And what we're doing is, there's a lot of planning going on, and we've done an awful lot of planning over the last 4 years, and prior to my administration as well. There's been a lot of planning in the city of Boston, but it's time for solutions right now, and it's time for investments right now. And so as I think about what efforts do we need, what can we share, is we have to continue planning and thinking about onshore solutions on how we protect the coast here in Boston, because a lot of our neighborhoods are affected by the harbor, Boston Harbor. And then it's also about, it's going to have to take a public investment, both three-way, from the city, from the state, the national government at some point, the federal government. It's going to have to take a public, it's going to have to take a development process whereas developers continue to want to develop in Boston, they will have to take some responsibility at some point about how do they make payments and how do they help us build these walls. And then also the nonprofit sector has to help us. And as I mentioned already, we have incredible foundations, and we have the Bar Foundation in Boston that's been actually not just talking about investments, but actually making those investments. So we're going to have to be working with other foundations as well to do more of that.
Bill?
So clearly I don't have one city to talk about, but I'll start with our North American hometown, Boston. That's where our headquarters is. The mayor mentioned our district energy network in Cambridge and Boston. At the heart of that is the largest CHP, combined heat and power plant in New England. And with the support from legislation that occurred back in 2008, the Green Communities Act, and with support from our host cities of Boston and Cambridge, we've invested close to $200 million in our network and the plant, which the end result becomes a 250,000 tons of carbon a year avoided. That's 50,000 cars taken off the road. That's 300 football fields covered with solar. So as we know, we have to hit this challenge from all angles. Combined heat and power is a key element of that. And then finally on Kendall, from a resiliency point, when we were investing in the plant, we also invested to make it a black start unit. So what that means is if there's a grid outage, our plant now is key to a plan to restore the grid. So not only do we have a climate play, but also a resiliency play for the local environment. Continue on just briefly on this notion of climate and resiliency and where they intersect. We're heavily involved in microgrids. So microgrid is fundamentally a small grid that's usually connected to the big power grid, but can disconnect. And at its heart, it typically will have a combined heat and power plant, so it's very green, very efficient. Can also use solar in tandem or other technologies. And so why is this important? Clearly it avoids carbon, but also from a resiliency perspective, as cities, critical infrastructure, businesses deal with storm events and deal with that threat, these grids are very resilient. A few years ago in Cambridge, we had a blackout. The only part of the Cambridge that was lit was the Biogen campus, because it has a microgrid with a CHP at its heart. During Sandy, we call it the tale of two NYUs. NYU main campus stayed lit throughout, but we all saw that Langone Hospital was being evacuated. The pictures in the news, the tragic pictures of sick people being taken out of a hospital because of the event. Well, guess what? Langone now has a combined heat and power microgrid that powers it, that we helped design and operate. So, and then move on to the final comment there, Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico obviously was devastated in the storms. And as you may all know, a big underpinning of the economy in Puerto Rico is the pharmaceutical industry. Well, the pharmaceutical industry, like any industry, isn't going to stay if they're too worried about business continuity. So we're working very closely with a number of those interests to try to design and install microgrids. So again, combined heat and power, because in northern climes, it's great for heating cities. In industrial environments, it's great to drive the process of whatever that industry is. So I think this idea of microgrids around critical infrastructure, hospitals, maybe municipal complexes, military bases, and industrial are, it's just a key element of how we play in the mix, and it's something cities really need to think about, because without these industries, without these assets, the people in the cities will suffer.
Bud?
Thanks, Vivien. Very nice to be here this morning. My last name is rather rare, so I compared notes with the mayor from Strasbourg this afternoon and this a little while ago, and it's just interesting to note. My name used to be Deyri. We were French. We were kicked out of France because we were Huguenots. Ended up in Amsterdam, which is why I'm Dutch, and I guess I work so much on sea level rise. I have a little bit of history there. You've heard mention a number of times of the Green Ribbon Commission this morning, and I thought I'd just give a little more detail on that, because I think it's a model that you might want to talk about with mayors and other cities around the United States. The Green Ribbon Commission, co-chaired by Ms. Hofstadter and Mayor Walsh, is a voluntary coalition of about 35 senior executives from major companies in the private sector here in Boston, particularly in the real estate and development and financial sectors. We have several presidents or senior executives of the major universities here in town, from BU, MIT, Harvard, and elsewhere, and also many of the senior executives from the hospital and healthcare sector in this city. And what's important about that is that if you look at the emissions in the city of Boston, 60% of the emissions come from the 50 largest property owners in the city. So we have many of those represented on our Green Ribbon Commission, which gives us an opportunity to work with them and engage them directly in the city's effort to green the city of Boston and also make it more resilient. And if you look at the track record of many of those major property owners, be they in the private sector or the non-profit sector, they've already reduced their emissions something like 20 to 25%. So it's really given us a leg up, and we're able to work with the city. Sometimes the city leads on projects, sometimes we lead on projects. It's a very healthy partnership. We helped design the Climate Ready Boston project. We've worked with them throughout. What's really important now, as the mayor talks about going from planning to implementation, and I think it's important to understand that the resilience issue particularly requires a lot of planning. You got to get the science straight. You got to figure out who, what, and where is going to be affected, and what that value is to the residents in the city of Boston. And then you've really got to pinpoint what to work on in terms of the solution strategy. And that's the stage we're at, thanks to the Climate Ready Boston project and the mayor's leadership on this issue. So what's really needed now going forward is a really concerted effort for the private sector and the public sector to work together on the finance strategy to implement the solutions that we now know where they are needed and what is needed.
So for all of you, thinking back, is there anything that you might have done differently? Are there any lessons learned that you think might be helpful to your colleagues here in the audience? And Bud, since you had the mic, I'm going to let you continue, and we'll continue on that.
These are issues, whether it's the mitigation track or the resilience side, where there is simply never enough public engagement. And we've done a lot of that, and the city's done a lot of it through the Imagine Boston planning process, through Climate Ready Boston, and so on. But I think there's an ever constant need to engage more and more people, whether they're in the neighborhoods that are vulnerable or whether they're business and other sectors that are going to be affected by climate change. We need everybody involved in this issue over the long term. It's not the issue that's going to rise to the top over the breakfast table every morning when people are worried about the cost of housing or healthcare or whatever. But as we saw from the flooding this past winter, we had a big wake-up call. And it was a lucky wake-up call because there wasn't a lot of damage, but it verified and validated the maps that we are using to pinpoint the risky areas in the city. But more and more people have to be alerted continuously.
Bill?
Where should I start on the list? Particularly in light of where we are in Boston, where there's been a huge spur in development over the last decade or so. When I look back, given the fact that we have this large district energy asset with a combined heat and power facility feeding it, we should have engaged the development community much sooner. So we have legislation that supports combined heat and power and district energy. We have friendly cities that are working with us to promote. But the development committee has its own drivers, has its own context, and I think between that and zoning, having more of a focus to work with cities earlier, particularly during a building boom, because once a building is designed, it's too late to change gears. Once the building is designed, the steel is purchased. So I think we really would have done a better job at getting in the process early. Cambridge, Mass. has come out with an interesting approach where if you're within the region of the combined heat and power plant, as a zoning element, you're required to take a look at it. We've worked close with Boston, and we're hopeful that we can have some similar spurs to the development community just to take a look at it. It's not a mandate. We don't expect a mandate because there's real economic decisions to be made. But just getting in that process earlier and really getting people to understand that you can be as cost effective and greener. And then at that point, why not? Why wouldn't we do it, particularly when we're all here to talk about the changing planet? So really that development phase getting in sooner.
Mayor Walsh, do you want to add anything?
I just think, I got elected in 1997, and every piece of legislation that dealt with energy environment I voted on. I had an A rating. But looking back now, I think more than voting on, I would have been more involved, more engaged. I think I would have pushed the city more in development, and I think there's a lesson to be learned there for all of us even today, and push the state, I should say, not the city, the state. I think looking today, I think that information still needs to be done. I think people, as Bud said, we have to educate the public, but not just the public. I think we have to educate the elected officials as well that are directing policy. Passing legislation is one thing, but actually following up with it's something more important. So I think that in my own case, I voted on it. I could say I did it and I'm an A, but that didn't really mean much today. When you become the chief executive officer of the city of Boston, it's a whole different story. And when we started Imagine Boston 2030, it was a master planning, first time in 50 years. We really started to see where we've made some great gains, but we've seen where we really had some significant shortfalls.
Maris, do you want to add anything?
Oh, en deux mots, je crois que les bonnes pratiques
the good practice
doivent être échangées.
have to be
Les choses positives que nous
have to
avons
be
fait,
changed,
ou
or have to be exchanged with other people. What is good, but the bad practices as well.
pratiques, les erreurs.
The mistakes, the errors that we did, and I made errors. That's a fact. Because I'm a human being.
Sont très intéressantes
Those are very important and very interesting to study so that we don't do it again, so that we take another direction. Just an example that comes to mind. In the north of Strasbourg, when we extended the tramway project, my goal back then was so that it would go through the different cities and towns. And the boutiques, the mayors of those little towns said, no, not to the center, not through us. And I think it was a mistake. It was an error. I believe it was, but it was done. But let's not do it again. And I believe that the exchange of information on good practices, but also bad practices, is a very interesting one to have.
Okay, I'm going to ask the last question, then we're going to open up for questions from the mayors. So what do you see as some of the future challenges as well as the opportunities to both local and regional resiliency solutions? I don't know, should we start at that end and work our way back?
Sure. Well, I think we've all mentioned financing, and it is the big gorilla in the room. If you look at what the city has now pinpointed in terms of shore-based solutions in the various neighborhoods along the waterfront in Boston for protection, it's a layered system of protection. Some of it involves shoreline structural measures right at the shoreline. There's zoning involved and various other components to it. But we're probably looking at $1 billion to $2.5 billion worth of projects that are going to need to be implemented. The good news is over maybe a couple of decades going forward. So, that's a big problem here. And as the mayor said, I think we have to combine, we have to get the private sector to really work together with the public sector to share in that. There are also really important fairness and equity issues, and these emerged a lot during the Climate Ready Boston work. Fairness is really interesting. If you look at the seaport, for example, where there are, 70,000 jobs and I don't know how many millions of square feet that have been developed, it's a really vulnerable area. Well, who pays for the solutions? Is it the people who own the properties along the water who have already gone to great lengths to protect their own buildings, but if they have to bear the burden of protection and everybody inland benefits, how do we find the right balance there? So, for example, the Mass Convention Center is inland in the seaport, and if other people pay to protect the shoreline, it also protects the convention center. How do we get the state involved and get them into the ballgame as well? And then there's a whole equity piece, and how do we focus public funds to really help the people who need it most? That's more complicated than just figuring out where they live. It may be where they work is more important to them than where they live. So we have to make sure they'll be able to get to work because they need their income for rent and everything else. And Seaport's another good example. You hear a lot of people say, well, that's where all that fancy new development is, let them help themselves. Well, in reality, 60, 70,000 people work there, many of which are jobs in the hospitality industry, in the service industry, et cetera. And that's the livelihood that's really important to those people. So it's a very complicated issue.
Bill?
Well, I think particularly storm-related asset hardening, infrastructure hardening is a critical issue for any coastal cities. And based on some of the events for even non-coastal cities, places like Baton Rouge, arguably Houston, where rain events have caused dramatic effects. I think cities are struggling with this issue of the investment and the expertise to get out there and figure out what needs to be done on a timeline that makes sense. And the resources are there. And part of the struggle is, the triple P, public-private partnership. Some people might think that's a 4-letter word, but it's actually 3. Other parts of the world have figured out how to do it. And there's such a mountain of money out there, of private money, and there's so much more money than there are actual opportunities, that their flexibility and cost of capital is pretty dramatic. And I mean, I think when you partner up that kind of access to capital with professional resources to aid cities, they can still maintain control of their assets, but they can bring some serious forces to bear on these challenges that you necessarily can't wait another 5 or another 10 or another 20 years. So I think there's really a reassessment of the proper use of triple Ps and this storm-related issue. I mean, we've done about a year's worth of work with New Orleans to try to help them figure out their plan and how to harden. And we've done a good job at that, but now the plan needs to go. So it's that next step.
Mayor Walsh.
I agree with what both Bill and Bud said, but I'm just going to add to growing population is something that is a good thing, I guess, but it's also a challenge. And sea level rise, which is an obvious one, but I've been mayor now for 5 winters. This was the first winter that when we were preparing for snowstorms, that we actually had long conversations around the tides. And that hadn't happened before, and that now will be forever in the future, us preparing and planning. So I think that those are things that the sea level rise is adding to the urgency, I think, here in Boston. I know for years we talked about in Boston Superstorm Sandy, if that hit Boston, what would have happened? And it was all hypotheticals, but we didn't have a Sandy event in Boston, but we had something that was pretty serious in Boston. And it wasn't just the South Boston waterfront, it was the North End, where we had hotels putting sand barriers in front of their buildings in East Boston. I live in Dorchester. The Neponset Circle was underwater. Parts of Charlestown were underwater. So those are some of our serious complications as far as moving forward.
Meredith.
Je pense que le contexte d'aujourd'hui.
Today's context is favorable to pedagogy for citizens. And let me explain that. In France, right now, we are experiencing tremendous storms. We've never experienced anything like that with torrential rains. We're experiencing almost a tropical planet, and that's not France's climate. So these are the first signs of the consequences of global warming on everybody's life. So we have to take advantage of these first signs to remind us of the goals of Paris's agreement. They're not unrealistic. We accept 2 degrees of increase of temperature averages, but no more. 2 degrees, we consider that it's acceptable because we know we can't do miracles. So right now, where we can measure this climate change, it is the time where we have to make people aware to citizens and political decision makers that they need to work together. This is the last exit. This is the last chance. We have to grasp it.
Okay, let's open it up to questions or comments from the mayors.
Vivien, I might just want to interject one thing in response to the mayor from Strasbourg, and that is to emphasize how important the link between mitigation and resilience is. If we want to get on the best case trajectory, which would produce the least amount of flooding in Boston and every other major city along the water in the world, we have to really bring down our emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. That's how we get on the safer curve to that 2-degree trajectory. So there's a very important link between mitigation and resilience.
Exactly. Okay, mayors. Yes.
Sly James.
I don't really need this for that. Well, first of all, thank you for the panel. Thanks for the information. I think the thing that a lot of us would like to know is, what do you see as perhaps the single most critical step that we can take in our cities to achieve a more sustainable environment? If you look at all the different things that you've talked about, some of those affect us. Sylvester Turner has a bigger problem with flooding than we do. We have more of a greenhouse gas emission issue than others. So where is the critical point of entry and resource development in order to become more efficient?
I think it's planning and knowing where your vulnerabilities are, and you do that through planning. I think that when I talked about it's Mayor James from Kansas City, by the way. Thank you, Mayor. I think when we think about making investments right now in the harbor, where do you go? Do you do the South Boston Waterfront first, as Bud talked about? That's where allegedly all the rich people are, or do you do the North End, or do you do East Boston? And it really is about planning and making and knowing where you need to make the investments. I think if we as mayors don't know where our challenges are, and we just kind of operate as everyone pops up, that's a recipe for disaster. So we have to understand where they are, so that's through planning.
Bud?
Boston, I think, is a good example. The building sector is really important. There are certain things that the city has control over, certain things the state can control, and certain things we depend on the federal government, either for funding or regulation. Buildings is an area where the city can exert great influence and where the private sector can really help out. In Boston, for example, buildings are, I think, 60 or 70% of the carbon emissions in the city. And what's important here is, and again, the intersection between mitigation and resilience, if we're going to make those buildings more efficient, let's make them more resilient at the same time. That's where we're going to get the biggest bang for the buck, particularly if we have to retrofit a lot of old housing, which is a big challenge here in Boston.
I'll just follow on, and it ties to both comments that were made. Understanding is key, so it's part of that planning element. I know, for example, when we did studies, they've done these resiliency studies, there's some real aha moments that cities really didn't know they had such vulnerabilities. You have to know before you can do something about it. So taking the effort, particularly around resiliency and storm-related events, is critical. I think buildings, they're the 60, 70% creators of carbon. To be a bit provocative, and I know it's been thrown around in different cities, but if we really believe this is such a challenge, don't we have to get to the point where we're going to have a miles per gallon or a kilowatt per square foot tag on buildings? I know that will run shivers down people's spine in some various communities.
I got thrown out of a meeting when I suggested that.
I know. So I said I was going to be provocative.
Yeah.
But it's challenging because we know we have cities with various classes of buildings, old buildings, new buildings, development coming on board. But again, it comes back to that knowledge piece. You can't really go after it and know as a city what your vulnerability is until you have the data, until you have the knowledge. So.
And I'm just going to throw in, I've just come from working for 2.5 years in Pittsburgh. And in Pennsylvania, there is a very strong presence of county government as well. And what is interesting is for a lot of these infrastructures, for example, airports and transportation, it crosses city boundaries. So being able to also work with your regional counterpart is important. And right now in Pittsburgh, together with Allegheny County, the two executives work together very well. But here in Boston, for example, the mayor works very closely with Massport, with other agencies, the MBTA and such. So, as cities look at these issues, very often they have to also think regionally as well. And certainly here in Boston, you've done a great job of that. And I'm sure you have too, Mayor, as, based on what you've done in Europe as well.
Si je peux me permettre juste un mot.
I'd like to add something about that. Today, for me, the priority, the urgency of all urgencies is to understand that we have just one planet. And those who think that in their little corners, in their own little cities or country, they can make people happy regardless of the rest of the world, they are strongly mistaken, not just politically, but also intellectually. In this interconnected world that we live in, through digital data, through everything else that bind us, we cannot think such as some people think in Europe, thinking, I don't care about the rest of the world, I take care of my own country, my own city. If you do that way, if you don't take care of the rest of the world is going to come to you and take care of you. And I think that national selfishness, national populism are going straight to the wall. We had to take initiatives locally the same way we do it today. With solidarity, we learn from each other. but the issue is a global one.
Yes.
Yeah, let me, Bill, let me follow up with you. I mean, and I agree with everything that y'all have said. And mitigation, resiliency go hand in hand. No question about that. And I'm the mayor of the city of Houston. So we've identified a number of projects that need to take place in order to make the city stronger, more resilient. But it always comes down to a question of resources, okay? And just relying, for example, on the feds to do what they have done in the past, you can't rely on that totally. You get some, but you won't get nearly what you need. And if, for example, the hurricane had hit the Galveston Bay, the damage to the whole region would have been horrific. And so we've talked about projects like what we call the coastal spine, but that's a $12 to $14 billion project. And the question is, what comes first? And generally, the mitigation should come before the disaster. So when you indicate that there are resources that are there waiting on the opportunities, let me ask you to drill down a little bit further on that and provide us with some more examples of what you're talking about. I understand P3 agreements, I understand that, but be a little bit more specific.
So in cases where cities that may have been lacking in investment for a period of time. So part of the issue of resiliency is not just maybe new design, new construction, or just getting the existing infrastructure up to par. We've looked at cases where, again, with private money, and in this case, bringing in a different operating profile to a city, where that we could look at funding, so a concession type arrangement, triple P, an upfront check, and then rate stabilization over a substantial period of time with investment, with defined investment upfront. It's not going to solve all the problem, but if it can take part of the issue away, you've only got so much bonding capacity. So if part of the problem can get solved in one area, maybe just on aging infrastructure and getting it up to par, maybe a capability can go elsewhere for a proactive means. But and the issue becomes the spread between the private money and the muni bond, even if you leave capacity out for a minute, just the spread. We've looked at a number of opportunities where we're willing to sign up for the fact that the savings that can be generated in a different operating profile can pretty much cover that spread and allow you to get rate stabilization with investment. So it takes a lot of work. It takes a paradigm shift in how you're thinking about things. You know, the funny thing about it is, look, every country, city, whatever has its own context. Other parts of the world have figured this out and figured out a way to really take advantage of all that resource that's out there, the funding. So I just think it takes more work. Each one of these triple Ps that happens, there's lessons learned. They're not well shared. Mm-hmm. So cities look out into the black hole of, oh my God, what is this going to look like? Where in fact, there's a lot of information out there that can be shared. I know the Obama administration held a forum a couple of years ago down in DC to bring together financiers, municipalities, and professional operators to try to bridge the gap. And they were trying to create a clearinghouse of information that the city could go in and look at this database of cases, case studies, to say, what does it look like? What does it mean to me? Do I get to still control my assets? What do I get at the end of the 30 years or 40 years? So I think it's going to take more work, but it's such a shame, and it's such a challenge from a resource perspective. I mean, literally, I could pick up the phone, and I'm not to sound braggadocious, but probably touch $15 billion in 2 days. That's how many calls we get and how much interaction we have with the private funding community. And we're the world's largest water company, for example, so they want to team up with us to try to approach cities. It's just amazing the amount of resource that is out there at attractive costs of capital, because again, as I said, there's a lot more money than there are projects, and they'll be flexible. It's a shame we're not using it.
And can I just, Mayor Walsh, you've done a good job with the private sector, engaging people like Boston Properties and such. Do you want to share some of that?
Yeah, I mean, Boston Properties is a whole different place.
I think we found our source here, haven't we?
I think that developers understand that they're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in projects or tens of millions of dollars of projects, that their asset is in trouble as well. And I think that, at the Green Ribbon Commission, what I think is amazing, I've been going to the meetings now for 4.5 years. They're always represented there, and I'm in and out because my schedule's crazy. But the owners or the owner's rep is always in the room, engaged in the conversation, proud of offering their support. Last meeting we had, the hospital's talking a little bit about what they're doing. That's what you need. You need a real estate community that's engaged and invested, understanding the asset. They know the value of their asset, and they know the importance of that asset, and they also know that by being part of the solution is helpful. And I think that we will all find that benefit. When Bill mentioned, putting on the side of the building a letter or a grade or miles per gallon, I think what happens there is you have owners of buildings that aren't as engaged, that own an asset for a longer period of time and don't understand the value of the asset, and they're concerned about that if we start to do that, and we've done some of that here in Boston a little bit, that they're going to have to put major money up front, and they're not realizing that they're actually preserving their asset by doing that. And so I think that having that connection is important. And as a mayor, we should have relationships with those folks already because they house our major employers. They provide jobs. They're part of our tax base. So it's important for us to be partners with them.
Did you want to?
On the resource question, I think what's challenging about resilience is, unlike, say, energy efficiency, where you invest in energy efficiency, you get cash back because you're saving money on your electric or gas bills every year. On the resilience side, you invest in resilience and you avoid future losses, but you don't get that ready stream of cash. And Massachusetts is allergic to new taxes, just like every other state in the nation. The mayor has the added problem of something here in Massachusetts called Prop 2.5, which limits severely the amount of spending that the city can do. So we're looking a lot at different mechanisms, more fees, whether it's a surcharge on water and sewer fees, maybe it's a premium or a surcharge on your insurance premiums, or other ways that would be fair and equitable to generate the kinds of resources that we need.
Okay, another question. Sorry, yes, please.
Un mot très concret.
One word.
J'étais il y a quelques semaines
A few weeks ago, I was in Mongolia, in the Chinese part of Mongolia. We have a Chinese colleague, I think, the mayor of Hangzhou, I think. And I want to acknowledge him. He knows what I'm talking about. So it was a conference organized by the United Nations at Ordorf. Ordorf is a new city. It's a superb new city on the architectural level. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. Large avenues. But the real problem for tomorrow, for China as well as the rest of the world, is how are we going to make sure that the existing cities evolve, Shanghai, Peking, Beijing, Paris, or others, to use other urban models. It is easy, in a way, to build a new city like the Chinese have done that. It was at the edge of the Gobi Desert. That we know how to do. And we know how to find funding for that. But change people's behavior and attitudes in existing cities, that's what is difficult. To create new development models, and it is to have to do it fast, because there's emergency here, and it is difficult. This is what we have to work on.
Okay, last question. Yes.
The City and County of Honolulu. I like what Mayor Strasburg, I wanted to add a comment to that about we're all interconnected. So we have the island of Oahu that I'm the mayor of. It's about as far away from any other major landmass anywhere in the world. But we have sea level rise, we have the heating of the oceans and the bleaching of the corals. We have major rain events. We had one on Kauai where over almost 50 inches of rain fell in a 24-hour period just last month. Hurricanes, Category 5 hurricanes coming by, 15 of them in the year 2015. Just huge impacts on our climate because of man-made warming of our planet. We are all connected. But I wanted to ask, the question, one was to Mayor Walsh, was you talked about raising of your road, I think in Charleston, or your park.
Charleston, yep.
And we have that issue in Honolulu. What do you do first? You pass building codes where you raise building podiums, but then what happens to the streets that are going to be flooded by sea level rise? Which do you do first? And I was interested to see you started, and I wanted to see how did you approach this issue of building a city or keeping the city where it is, but addressing the rise in sea level?
It's complicated. It can't be done everywhere. In Charlestown, is the section of Main Street that we're raising, we can do that. There are other parts of Charlestown, there are other parts of Boston, we just can't raise the roadway because we've raised the roadway 6 feet. You're on the second floor of a three-decker in the neighborhood. And it does go back to, again, how does that work on the resiliency piece of where the water comes into the city. And it goes back to planning. It's easier on the waterfront. See, one thing about Boston, if you haven't been touring our city, the South Boston waterfront, the original design of the waterfront is a little different than what you see today. So the projects that are there today, they're actually built right on the water. What I think we would have done if we could back that project up 20 years, it was on the question we asked earlier was about designing and planning. What they're doing in Brooklyn, New York, is important. They're creating an open space on the waterfront, and they're building behind that. We lost that opportunity in Boston. In Charlestown, it's one of the oldest parts of our city, so many of those homes are old brownstones. So we can't raise the roadway. So it's not like simply we're not raising the roadway all over Boston and then have to jack up the homes. We're doing it in places that we can do it. It's a difficult task. We have Marcy Boulevard, which is another roadway in Dorchester, in Boston. It's a parkway into the city for the most part. We're going to be able to raise the roadway there because we have no homes there, and raise it 6 or 7 feet if we have to. So it's challenging. It's a really challenging situation. I know I didn't answer your question properly, but I have to talk to you privately about it. It's just really challenging in certain areas.
So I want to thank all the mayors for the great questions, and I want to thank our panelists. We're going to take a break now. Our panelists have agreed to be around during the break and obviously at lunch and such, so you can follow up with them. So thank you to all of you.
We will now have a short coffee break. Our next panel will begin at 10:45 a.m.
We see you.
Oh, 2020?
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Viv. Good job.